Have you ever imagined what it was like to live in America in past centuries, or wished you could go back in time and see what was happening all over the nation? Well, here's your chance. Get ready to visit 50 great years in American history. Let's start with 1782.
By 1782, Americans had claimed victory in the Revolutionary War, but conflicts continued. As British troops began withdrawing from U.S. cities, they continued to skirmish with the Americans until a preliminary peace treaty was signed in the fall. To honor those who fought, General George Washington established the Badge of Military Merit, which came to be known as the Purple Heart. That year, Congress passed legislation creating a government monopoly on mail delivery, and the new country adopted its Great Seal. On the state level, Virginia legislators declared it legally possible for slave owners to set their slaves free. While in Massachusetts, the opening of Harvard's new medical school meant young men no longer had to travel abroad to study medicine. And American furniture designers were said to have achieved a level of craftsmanship equal to any in the world. This was America in 1782.
In 1785, improved transportation brought Americans closer together. The first regular stagecoach route was established connecting Boston and New York. The trip took passengers 6 19-hour days to complete. And America's first toll road opened in Virginia. The Little River Turnpike was built along an old Indian hunting path from Alexandria to the Shenandoah Valley. In March, Henry Knox became Secretary of War, supervising a civilian staff of 4, a budget of $176, and a navy with no ships. By the time Knox resigned 9 years later, he'd laid the groundwork for reestablishing the Navy. Also that year, a Delaware miller built the first automated assembly line, enabling him to grind 3 times as much grain at less than half the labor cost. This was America in 1785. In 1797, America was tested on the high seas. With hardware provided by Paul Revere, the USS Constitution and 2 other frigates were built to combat French privateers seizing American ships in the West Indies. France, at war with Britain, was trying to shut down trade between the U.S. and England. Congress responded by ordering America's militia to mobilize for war against France. Meanwhile, in the Mediterranean, the Barbary pirates were looting American vessels. Instead of sending our fleet to do battle on yet another front, newly inaugurated Second President John Adams agreed to pay tribute to the pirates to protect U.S. ships. In rural America, farmers were voicing their concern about a cast-iron plow invented by Charles Newbold. They feared it might poison the soil because it was made of metal. This was America in 1797.
In 1799, the newly formed American Navy scored its first major victory in an undeclared war against French piracy. The USS Constellation captured the French Navy ship Insurgente in the West Indies and took 173 of her crew prisoner. As American merchant ships expanded their trade routes, the first ever products imported from Japan arrived in Boston Harbor. In America's first organized labor action, shoemakers walked off the job. They won the 9-day strike, coining a new term in the process. Strikebreakers have been called scabs ever since. At year's end, Americans said goodbye to their country's founding father. George Washington died in his Mount Vernon home at the age of 67. Fellow General Light Horse Harry Lee eulogized the late president as first in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen. This was America in 1799.
In 1801, former Secretary of State John Marshall was appointed Chief Justice of the Supreme Court by outgoing President John Adams. Having defeated Adams by a narrow margin, Thomas Jefferson became the first president inaugurated in Washington, D.C. One of the first issues he had to contend with was the Barbary pirates. Payments to safeguard American ships had become excessive, so Jefferson refused to pay and sent the U.S. Navy to blockade Tripoli and keep the waters of the Mediterranean safe for Americans. That same year, the city of Philadelphia installed a system of aqueducts powered by a steam engine. This miracle of technology delivered fresh water to the growing city. On another scientific front, a complete mastodon skeleton was unearthed in upstate New York. At last, scientists had an idea of what the prehistoric animal might have looked like. This was America in 1801.
In 1802, the U.S. Patent Office was established, and William Thornton was appointed as its first superintendent. Mr. Thornton had come to the attention of Congress when he submitted the winning plan for the new Capitol building. In Connecticut, Abel Porter opened America's first brass mill. Run on horsepower, his mill would provide the buttons for military uniforms for the next 150 years. The nation's first hotel, the Union Hotel, was built at Saratoga Springs, New York by Gideon Putnam. Also in New York, Congress established the country's first military academy. The site chosen was West Point on the Hudson River. In rural America, farmers and their families fought boredom and isolation by creating their own forms of entertainment. Log rolling, shooting competitions, barbecues, and get-togethers flourished, while dances like country jigs and the Virginia reel remained popular. This was America in 1802.
In 1804, Americans explored new lands and learned more about their natural surroundings. Meriwether Lewis, President Jefferson's personal secretary, and William Clark, an Army officer, set off on an expedition to explore and map the West. Over the next 2 years, they would travel all the way to the Pacific Ocean and return with scouting reports about Indians and the West's abundant natural resources. Other Americans were also getting in touch with nature. John James Audubon began drawing and classifying birds. The first agricultural fair was held in Washington, D.C. The first of California's large orange groves was planted. And the first bananas were imported from Cuba. It was also during this year that Aaron Burr killed Alexander Hamilton in a duel over personal and political accusations. This was America in 1804. The events of 1811 served to shake up and shape up a young country. A huge earthquake flattened forests along the Mississippi and Ohio valleys. The quake shook an area that today covers 27 states and opened cracks that stretched as long as 15 miles. In Cumberland, Maryland, construction began on the first major federal highway project. Called the National Road, it would stretch from Baltimore through western Virginia and on to the Illinois frontier. The country expanded southward, too, as Congress met in secret session to approve plans to annex Spanish East Florida. It also authorized the construction of the first naval hospitals. In November, General William Henry Harrison defeated the Shawnee Indians at the Battle of Tippecanoe in northeast Indiana. The victory gave Americans confidence in their newly issued long rifles. This was America in 1811.
Early in 1815, Major General Andrew Jackson and 5,000 troops defended the city of New Orleans against a superior force of 8,000 British redcoats. Aided by the notorious pirate Jean Lafitte, Jackson crushed the British with very few casualties. What neither side knew was that the War of 1812 had ended 2 weeks earlier with the signing of the Treaty of Ghent. After the war, rebuilding began on the Capitol and the Executive Mansion, both of which had been burned by the British. A new coat of paint would inspire a nickname for the president's home, the White House. Soldiers returning home from the war found progress had changed things. Open hearth cooking was being replaced by the newly patented James Cook stove, and candlelight would soon give way to the use of natural gas just discovered in Western Virginia. This was America in 1815.
In 1817, Virginian James Monroe was inaugurated as the 5th President of the United States. He promptly pardoned the pirate Jean Lafitte for his service during the War of 1812, and Lafitte promptly went back to piracy. The Seminole Indian War began as U.S. troops were sent in to subdue tribes responsible for raids along the border of West Florida. In New York, the state legislature authorized the building of the Erie Canal. The price tag was $7 million for a waterway that would link the Great Lakes with the Hudson River and the Atlantic Ocean. In Tennessee, noted frontiersman Davy Crockett served as a justice of the peace. The first free public school for the deaf was opened in Hartford, Connecticut. And off the coast of Gloucester, Massachusetts, a strange sighting was reported. Witnesses described seeing a sea serpent 100 feet in length with a long tongue. This was America in 1817.
In 1818, Americans proudly flew a newly standardized U.S. flag. Congress voted to add a star for each new state, but fixed the number of stripes at 13 for the original 13 colonies. In March, veterans of the Revolutionary War received lifetime pensions from a Congress that also established the Army Medical Corps. In New York Harbor, the James Monroe set sail for Liverpool, England, beginning the first regular transatlantic shipping service. And in Florida, the first Seminole Indian War ended when General Andrew Jackson captured a Seminole stronghold and several Spanish forts. The U.S. believed that Spain had been sheltering hostile Indians and runaway slaves. Spain protested Jackson's offensive, which had not been officially authorized. But the Spanish minister was told that if he couldn't control the Indians and govern Florida, perhaps it should be turned over to the United States. It would be a year later. This was America in 1818.
In 1820, new sports gained acceptance in America. Rough and tumble soccer-like games were played on college campuses, evolving into the nation's first football game. And the odd pastime of team squirrel shooting became popular. In Colorado, intrepid explorer and botanist Edwin James became the first person to climb to the summit of Pikes Peak. Some thought it should be renamed James Peak, but others disagreed, and the name Pikes Peak remained. Americans relaxed with new books, as Washington Irving published Rip Van Winkle and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. His works and those of others were housed in the country's first state-supported libraries. As Americans enjoyed their newfound activities, the Fourth National Census counted 9.6 million citizens and listed New York as the nation's most populous city. This was America in 1820. In 1824, four popular presidential hopefuls split the electoral vote after a bitterly fought campaign. The outcome was left up to the members of the House of Representatives. They had to choose among former Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, war hero Andrew Jackson, Secretary of the Treasury William H. Crawford, and Speaker of the House Henry Clay. The House elected Adams as the country's sixth president. Out west, General William Ashley scouts discovered a huge salty lake west of the Rockies, and Congress authorized the Army Corps of Engineers to survey rivers and plan waterways. In Rhode Island, a group of cloth weavers held the first recorded strike in the U.S. that involved female employees. And with families having to provide much of their own entertainment, humorous and sentimental sing-along songs became very popular. This was America in 1824.
On the 4th of July in 1826, Americans said goodbye to both Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. The ex-presidents and old rivals died within hours of each other on America's 50th birthday. Also in 1826, the first permanent fort west of the Mississippi was established at Jefferson Barracks, Missouri. The outpost aided westward expansion with housing and training for 22 companies of soldiers. And as settlers continued to claim new lands, James Fenimore Cooper published Last of the Mohicans. The book sold more than 2 million copies and became a bestseller both in the United States and abroad. The Lyceum, our public speaking organization, had Americans talking about science, history, and public affairs. While others exercised their minds, Harvard instructor Charles Follen introduced physical education and gymnastics into college curriculums. This was America in 1826.
In 1827, Americans had many reasons to celebrate. Mardi Gras was introduced in New Orleans by French-American students. They organized a costume parade through the streets before the beginning of Lent. Slavery was officially abolished in New York, freeing 10,000 slaves. And Army troops helped to end the Winnebago Indian War in Wisconsin. The war had started because of the continued intrusions made by lead miners into tribal lands. In Virginia, the daughter of Thomas Jefferson received a $20,000 gift from South Carolina and Louisiana to help offset her late father's debts. The first sawmill in the Pacific Northwest started logging operations. The area would become the largest producer of timber in the country. In Boston, the first swimming school in the nation was opened, and Edgar Allan Poe published his first book of poetry. This was America in 1827.
In 1828, Americans sought expansion and new ideas and a new leader. President John Quincy Adams lost his re-election bid to bitter rival Andrew Jackson. President Jackson was the only ex-prisoner of war to become president, having been captured by the British in the Revolutionary War. Recognizing America's thirst for knowledge, an Englishman named James Smithson left money in his will for a national learning foundation to be set up in the United States. It was to be called the Smithsonian Institute. Americans also expanded their vocabulary, as Noah Webster published the American Dictionary of the English Language. And they expanded their western horizons as groundbreaking was held for the first commercial railroad line, the Baltimore and Ohio. Also that year, an old idea was getting some new attention. The expanding popularity of archery soon led to the formation of the nation's first archery club. This was America in 1828.
In 1830, Americans welcomed home the first U.S. Navy ship to circle the globe. The 16-gun sloop of war Vincennes returned to New York Harbor after a 4-year journey, and a 33-year-old warship, the Constitution, was saved from the scrap heap by public outcry. Americans became aware of the problem when Oliver Wendell Holmes published his poem, Old Ironsides. Americans also focused on their health in 1830. The Army canceled the regular daily issue of whiskey for each soldier. And temperance leader, Sylvester Graham, promoted the healthful properties of bathing at least 3 times a week, vigorous exercise, and coarsely ground wheat flour baked into his graham cracker. Out west, the first wagon train crossed the Rockies, led by mountain man Jedediah Smith. This was America in 1830.
In 1832, America was on the move. John Stephenson's new horse-drawn car gave New York City the world's first streetcar system. But for those looking to leave city life behind, the Oregon Trail became the main route west. Leaving Independence, Missouri, the trail wound its way westward to the Pacific Ocean. Exploring the northern frontier, Army Lieutenant James Allen discovered the source of the Mississippi River. In Baltimore, the first of the new clipper ships, the Ann McKim, was launched. Designed for size and speed, these ships would rule the seas until the advent of steam power. Advancements were also being made in agriculture, as Cyrus McCormick demonstrated his new machine. The reaper could harvest grain twice as fast as a man. And in Illinois, a young man by the name of Abraham Lincoln ran for his first public office and lost. This was America in 1832.
In 1837, Americans witnessed a number of firsts. In New York City, Samuel Morse demonstrated the first electric telegraph. The town of Chicago, with a population of just over 3,000, was incorporated as a city. And in Cincinnati, William Proctor and James Gamble created a business partnership with a $7,000 investment. The first Marine Corps general officer was appointed that year. Archibald Henderson was promoted to Brigadier General for gallant and meritorious service in the Second Seminole Indian War. The U.S. Senate voted down the first bid by Texas for statehood because it wanted to avoid confronting the slavery question. And in New York City, a showman named P.T. Barnum staged his first promotion. He tried to convince the public that a woman named Joyce Heth was a 161-year-old nurse who had brought George Washington into the world. This was America in 1837. 1841 was a year of strange events in America. After catching pneumonia during his Chile inauguration ceremony, William Henry Harrison died only a month after becoming the nation's 9th president. Old Tippecanoe, as Harrison was called, was succeeded by the first vice president to assume the presidency, John Tyler. But later in the year, when President Tyler vetoed a popular bill for rechartering the Bank of the United States, all the members of his cabinet, except Daniel Webster, resigned in protest. On the diplomatic front, the French government broke off relations with Texas when the French minister's personal pigs were killed by an Austin hotel keeper. In Washington, the Navy issued the first regulations standardizing the uniforms of its enlisted personnel. And Edgar Allan Poe's Murders in the Rue Morgue introduced the detective story to the world. This was America in 1841.
In 1848, important cornerstones were laid in a growing America. Women's rights advocates held their first convention in upstate New York, where Elizabeth Cady Stanton and abolitionist Lucretia Mott argued for a woman's right to vote. In Pennsylvania, legislators passed the first child labor law. It established the minimum work age at 12. In February, the United States and Mexico signed a peace treaty ending a 2-year war, which had claimed 13,000 American lives. The treaty gave a huge part of the West to the United States, including land that would become California, Nevada, Arizona, and Utah, where seagulls saved that year's crops from huge swarms of crickets. On the 4th of July, the cornerstone for the Washington Monument was laid, using the same trowel George Washington had used for the Capitol building. The monument would take 36 years to finish. This was America in 1848.
In 1850, California became the nation's 31st state. and the population of the U.S. at 23 million passed that of Great Britain. After squabbling for years about who would build and control a canal across Central America, the U.S. and Britain signed a treaty ending the long-standing dispute. The Clayton-Bulwer Treaty provided joint control of a future canal, but left the issue of who would build it and where it would be built unresolved. Also that year, the first regular cross-country overland mail route was established west of the Mississippi. Mail was carried monthly from Independence, Missouri to Salt Lake City, Utah. With news traveling more efficiently, trends in fashion spread across the country. Men, for example, were wearing cutaway coats for morning and evening, with ample pockets in the tails. This was America in 1850.
Americans in 1851 tried to conquer the elements. In an effort to control fires, the first electric fire alarm system was installed in Boston. In Florida, Dr. John Gorey invented an artificial ice-making machine. The ice it produced was used to cool the rooms of feverish patients. Harnessing the wind, a yacht named America stunned the sailing world by defeating 14 of Britain's best boats. The trophy presented to the U.S. crew was named the America's Cup in honor of the winning vessel. And a whale of a tale, Moby Dick, was published by Herman Melville. In Washington, the Army Corps of Engineers took over the job of adding office wings to the Capitol building. Out west, Major James Savage discovered the Yosemite Valley while he was pursuing a band of Indians. And hoping to cut the cost of food and its transportation, the Army began raising crops on its military posts. This was America in 1851.
In 1855, a fight over slavery led to bloodshed in Kansas as two separate groups claimed to be the rightful government of the territory. Congress had allowed settlers to vote on whether Kansas would be a free or slave state. Pro-slavery candidates won, but anti-slavery forces claimed election fraud and set up their own government. Congress also voted that year to award citizenship to children born abroad to American parents and to foreign wives who married American husbands. The science of oceanography was born when Navy Lieutenant Matthew Maury published the first organized study of the oceans. And a suspension bridge at Niagara Falls was completed, connecting the U.S. and Canada. In Wisconsin, German immigrants established America's first kindergarten, and a nationwide craze for wild strawberries gave birth to a new dessert, strawberry shortcake. This was America in 1855.
In 1858, the first transoceanic telegraph cable was laid down, connecting the United States with Great Britain. Organized by American financier Cyrus Field, it allowed President Buchanan and Queen Victoria to trade messages over some 3,000 miles before it broke down just 28 days later. Establishing another connection, stagecoach service opened between San Francisco and St. Louis. The 20-day trip covered 2,600 miles and passed through deserts, plains, and hostile Indian territory. While some connections were made, other gaps widened. Federal troops were sent to the Utah Territory to control hostilities between Mormons and other settlers. And the Illinois Senate race featured the Lincoln-Douglas debates, which offered opposing viewpoints on the controversial topic of slavery. This was America in 1858.
The events of 1865 changed the course of a nation. At Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant, ending the Civil War. Just 6 days later, President Abraham Lincoln died after being shot at Ford's Theater by actor and Southern sympathizer John Wilkes Booth. In July, charges were brought against the commandant of Andersonville, the notorious Confederate prison. For his offenses, Captain Henry Wirz was hanged. He was the only Confederate official executed for war crimes. By year's end, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was passed, abolishing slavery. As Americans absorbed these monumental events, one man looked toward the future. French author Jules Verne predicted that the United States would lead the world in the conquest of space. This was America in 1865.
In 1867, America laid claim to faraway lands while continuing to improve life at home. Alaska was purchased from Russia for $7 million at the urging of Interior Secretary William Seward. Amid howls of protest, troops were sent to occupy what some called Seward's Folly. In the Pacific, America claimed a small island named Midway. When Navy Captain William Reynolds raised the American flag over the island, it became the first U.S. territory outside of North America. On the mainland, life continued to improve for Americans. The first elevated railway began carrying commuters through New York City, and the first typewriter was invented, but it only typed in capital letters, and only on tissue paper. Steps were also taken to expand education. That year, 2 colleges, Howard University in Washington, D.C., and Morehouse College in Augusta, Georgia, were founded to educate ex-slaves. This was America in 1867.
In 1868, America was still recovering from the Civil War. 7 of the 11 former Confederate states were readmitted to the Union. And America celebrated its first National Memorial Day when General John Logan had soldiers decorate Civil War graves across the country. In February, President Andrew Johnson was impeached by the House for disobeying Congress, but after a dramatic trial, the Senate acquitted him by 1 vote. Later that year, Northern War hero Ulysses S. Grant was elected president, while another Civil War veteran, John Wesley Powell, began an expedition along the Colorado River. Powell and his men explored a vast chasm carved by the river, which he named the Grand Canyon. Also that year, federal employees had their workday limited to 8 hours, and A.M. Hills invented the lawnmower. This was America in 1868.
In 1873, bank failures across America created a panic, as too many banks made bad investments. At the height of the crisis, the New York Clearing House, where stocks were exchanged, closed for 10 days. Out west, Brigadier General E.R.S. Canby was shot and killed by Indians. Ironically, the shooting occurred at a peace council Canby arranged to bring an end to the California Indian War. In Iowa, Jesse James and his gang were well known for their bank robberies, but they made new headlines when they robbed their first train. All was not bad news, though. Free mail delivery was given to cities with populations of 20,000 or more. The discovery of silver in Nevada started another rush of miners to the west. And in New York City, Bellevue Hospital opened the first nursing school in the country. This was America in 1873.
Americans had reform on their minds in 1874. Delegates from across the country met in Cleveland to fight the evils of drink. They formed the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And the state of Massachusetts reformed its labor laws to limit the length of the workday for women and children to 10 hours. On the Great Plains, life for farmers and cattlemen was revolutionized by Joseph Glidden's new invention, barbed wire. Now vast tracts of land could be cheaply fenced off, enabling the frontier to be turned into farmland. In August, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer announced that he had found gold in the Black Hills while looking for a safe passage through the Dakota Territory. And the country's first zoo opened in Philadelphia. This was America in 1874.
In 1876, the nation's Centennial Exhibition, held in Philadelphia, drew almost 10 million people. The most popular attraction was the Machinery Hall, featuring the world's largest steam engine, an icebox cooled by ammonia, a rotary printing press, and Alexander Graham Bell's newly patented telephone. On a somber note, the Battle of the Little Bighorn claimed the lives of more than 250 soldiers from the 7th Cavalry, including their commander, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. The battle erupted as Sioux and Cheyenne Indians, led by Chief Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, fought to keep their tribal lands on the Great Plains. Also slain that year was lawman Wild Bill Hickok, shot in the back while playing poker. The cards he held, aces and eights, have since been dubbed the Dead Man's Hand. This was America in 1876.
Gunshots fired in 1881 echoed across America. In July, newly inaugurated President James Garfield was shot and fatally wounded by a disgruntled office seeker. Garfield was succeeded by Vice President Chester A. Arthur. In the New Mexico Territory, Sheriff Pat Garrett gunned down the notorious outlaw Billy the Kid. And in Tombstone, Arizona, Doc Holliday and the Earp brothers shot it out with the Clanton Gang at the OK Corral. In Washington, D.C., Clara Barton worked to heal, organizing the American Red Cross. And in New York City, the Edison Electric Lighting System went into operation with 85 paying customers. Further uptown, construction was completed on the Fifth Avenue home of William Vanderbilt. His mansion started a trend among millionaires to build extravagant houses, imitating the chateaus and palaces of Europe. This was America in 1881.
In 1886, America produced a variety of new products and ideas. The construction of two new ironclad vessels, the Maine and the Texas, continued a modernization program for the U.S. Navy. Richard Sears began selling watches through the mail. And John Pemberton invented a new soft drink he called Coca-Cola. The Statue of Liberty, a gift from the people of France, was dedicated in New York Harbor. In South Carolina, an earthquake took the city of Charleston by surprise, claiming 40 lives and causing $5 million worth of property damage. In San Francisco Bay, an island fortress named Alcatraz became a military prison. And in the fashionable resort town of Tuxedo Park, New York, men first began stepping out wearing a formal dress suit without tails. It's been known as the tuxedo ever since. This was America in 1886.
In 1892, Frank and Charles Duryea designed, built, and tested the nation's first gasoline-powered car in Springfield, Massachusetts, while in Chicago, the first electric automobile rolled through city streets. In Norfolk, Virginia, the Navy launched its first armored battleship, the USS Texas, and merchant ships brought thousands of immigrants to a new receiving station on Ellis Island in New York Harbor. Grover Cleveland was elected president again, making him the first chief executive to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. In California, naturalist John Muir and other conservationists founded the Sierra Club to protect the nation's scenic resources. And the sports world heralded its first heavyweight boxing champion when gentleman Jim Corbett knocked out John L. Sullivan in the 21st round. This was America in 1892.
Americans were on the move in 1896. The discovery of gold in Alaska sparked a rush of thousands to the Klondike region. While in Boston, the country's first subway system was completed, alleviating some of the congestion on city streets. At Fort Missoula, Montana, the Army formed the 25th Infantry Bicycle Corps to see if the new mode of transportation could replace the horse. Across the ocean in Greece, American James Connolly became the first person in modern times to receive an Olympic gold medal. He placed first in the triple jump at the revival of the Games, the first held in more than 1,500 years. To keep people tapping their feet, John Philip Sousa composed one of his most famous marches, The Stars and Stripes Forever, and people lined up to buy the first book with accurate cooking measurements. Published by Fanny Farmer, it was the forerunner of modern cookbooks. This was America in 1896.
In 1906, America suffered one of its worst natural disasters when a catastrophic earthquake struck the city of San Francisco. Hundreds of people died and more than 25,000 buildings were destroyed. Federal troops were dispatched to fight fires, maintain order, and help with relief efforts. Later that year, Theodore Roosevelt became the first American to receive a Nobel Prize. He was also the first president to set foot on foreign soil when he visited Panama to inspect the construction of the canal. Out west, Devil's Tower, Wyoming became the first natural landmark to be designated a national monument. And at the Battle Creek, Michigan Sanitarium, owned by Dr. John Kellogg, cornflakes were accidentally invented when cooks left boiling grain unattended. This was America in 1906.
In 1921, Americans paid tribute to those who were killed in action during the First World War. An unknown soldier who had fallen in battle was buried in Arlington National Cemetery during dedication ceremonies hosted by President Warren G. Harding. As Americans paid their respects to the past, one man embodied the potential of the future. Professor Albert Einstein arrived in New York to lecture on his new theory of relativity, which would open up the world of nuclear physics. Off the coast of Virginia, Army aircraft sunk the Ostfriesland, a former German battleship. The demonstration was staged by General Billy Mitchell to support his belief that air power was superior to sea power. In Atlantic City, New Jersey, the first Miss America beauty pageant was held. And, citing moral decadence, the city of Zion, Illinois banned the playing of jazz in public. This was America in 1921. By 1930, the stock market crash of the previous year had grown into a nationwide depression. In New York City, the Bank of the United States failed, joining more than 1,300 other banks that had closed since the crash. Unemployment skyrocketed to more than 4.5 million, and President Hoover won approval from Congress for a $116 million emergency job program. To better serve the nation's veterans, Congress consolidated all federal agencies providing relief to ex-servicemen into a single organization, the Veterans Administration. As commercial air travel increased in popularity, the first stewardesses began to take care of passengers. Initially, only nurses were hired for the jobs. And a new planet was discovered when astronomers detected Pluto at the edge of the solar system. This was America in 1930. In 1933, Americans were still coping with the Depression as they embraced a new president and his optimism. Franklin D. Roosevelt began his administration with 100 days of bold legislation that created agencies to promote recovery and stopped a run on the banks by temporarily closing them. He also began his fireside chats to keep up the people's spirits. But not everyone loved Roosevelt. Before his inauguration, a jobless bricklayer attempted to assassinate FDR in Miami. He killed Chicago Mayor Anton Cermak and wounded 4 others, but missed the president-elect. High above the earth, Navy Lieutenant Commander Thomas Settle and Marine Corps Major Chester Fordney became the first Americans to pilot a balloon into the stratosphere. While back on the ground, Americans celebrated the end of Prohibition and enjoyed new dances like the rumba and the boogie woogie. This was America in 1933.
In 1935, Americans were putting technology to work. The first American airplane with hydraulically powered folding wings was tested, and the DC-3 commercial aircraft began its long and dependable service. For the first time, regular airline passenger service across the Pacific Ocean was offered, from San Francisco to Manila. Also crossing the Pacific that year, Amelia Earhart became the first person to fly solo between Hawaii and California. Traveling even further, the first round-the-world telephone call was made. It was transmitted from an office in New York City, crossed 23,000 miles, and arrived at another office only 50 feet from the caller. In a more entertaining application of technology, the first night game in Major League Baseball was played between the Reds and the Phillies at Cincinnati's Crosley Field. The Phillies won the game, 2-1. This was America in 1935.
Americans began 1936 by feeling more secure about their golden years. The Social Security Act, which provided for the payment of old age benefits, went into effect on January 1st. Near Las Vegas, workers completed Hoover Dam on the Colorado River. It was the largest in the world and also created America's largest reservoir, Lake Mead. The dam would provide hydroelectric power to much of the Southwest. A new diesel train, the Super Chief, began operating between Chicago and Los Angeles. It made the trip in under 40 hours, and more importantly, it was air-conditioned. The Army also benefited from new technology when it designated the M1 rifle as its weapon of choice. It was the first self-loading rifle to be adopted as standard issue by any Army. On the domestic front, the popularity of automobile trailers increased dramatically, and some predicted that half the country would soon be living in mobile homes. This was America in 1936.
In 1946, America had accepted its role as a leading world power. The U.S. announced it would occupy South Korea until North Korea was free of Soviet troops. As tensions mounted, an atomic bomb, the most powerful yet, was tested at Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands. And off the coast of Virginia, an all-jet airplane made the first landing on an aircraft carrier. Later that year, the United Nations met in New York City for the first time after deciding to seek a permanent home in the United States. The Navy sponsored the largest expedition ever sent to Antarctica. Admiral Richard Byrd led 4,700 men in an operation that discovered new land masses and mapped previously unexplored coastlines. Back home, ration-weary consumers went on massive buying sprees, snapping up new products like inexpensive watches and electric blankets. This was America in 1946.
In 1953, an armistice was signed in Korea, ending the 3-year conflict that cost more than 55,000 American lives. But America continued to strengthen its military might. President Harry Truman announced the U.S. had successfully tested a hydrogen bomb, and Air Force Major Chuck Yeager reached a record airspeed of more than 1,600 miles per hour in a rocket-powered plane. The Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to a professional soldier for the first time, General George Marshall, who had been praised for helping to make the U.S. Army the greatest fighting force in the world, received the prize for his plan to revive war-torn Europe. Another American military hero, Dwight D. Eisenhower, became the first president to be sworn in on national television, and Richard and Mac McDonald decided on a distinctive building for their hamburger shop. This was America in 1953.
In 1955, America focused on the health and welfare of its citizens. New York physician Jonas Salk perfected his polio vaccine. And the National Hurricane Center was established in Miami, Florida, after Hurricanes Connie and Diane devastated the eastern seaboard. To improve the country's ability to protect itself, the first B-52 bomber entered service with the Air Force. The Stratofortress would become the backbone of the Air Force's bombing fleet for the next 35 years. Looking out for the welfare of working people, Congress raised the minimum wage to $1 an hour. And as rock and roll hits began crowding the music charts, some critics attacked the lively sound as being immoral and contributing to juvenile delinquency. Meanwhile, television's frontier hero, Davy Crockett, had the nation's youngsters wearing coonskin caps. This was America in 1955.
In 1960, the sit-in became a popular form of nonviolent civil rights protests after 4 black students refused to leave a white lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. On the James River in Virginia, the first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, the USS Enterprise, was launched. At the time, it was the largest moving structure ever built, capable of making 20 trips around the world without stopping. Presidential candidates John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon debated live on TV, and many felt that Kennedy's performance helped him win the election that fall. International diplomacy was affected when an American U-2 plane was shot down over Russia. President Eisenhower's admission that it was a spy plane caused the cancellation of a peace summit. And the twist became the latest dance craze as Chubby Checker's record moved to #1 on the charts. This was America in 1960. In 1961, an energetic new president, John F. Kennedy, held the first presidential news conference broadcast on live television. He also formed the Peace Corps, an organization of men and women who volunteered to help people in undeveloped areas overseas. And he sent additional Green Beret advisors and 2 Army helicopter units to Vietnam. The choppers helped airlift South Vietnamese troops into action and were the first direct American military aid to the war-torn country. Big strides were taken in the space program as astronaut Alan Shepard became the first American in space. Back on Earth, television was called a vast wasteland, as critics demanded more educational programs. And the Yankees' Roger Maris hit his 61st home run in the final game of the season, passing Babe Ruth's mark of 60 that some thought would stand forever. This was America in 1961.
In 1965, Americans were fighting communism in Southeast Asia and discrimination at home. In Alabama, more than 25,000 people marched to the Capitol from Selma. Led by Martin Luther King Jr., the crowd protested discrimination against Black Americans. The first U.S. ground combat troops landed in Vietnam and began engaging the Viet Cong in battalion-sized offensives. Out in space, Pioneer 6 began its mission to study our solar system. And Ed White became the first American to walk in space, spending some 20 minutes outside his Gemini spacecraft. Back on Earth, Craig Breedlove set a land speed record of more than 600 miles per hour at the Bonneville Salt Flats in Utah. The Houston Astrodome opened as the largest air-conditioned stadium in the world. And unisex styles were all the rage, with pants for women and longer hair for men. This was America in 1965.
In 1973, American involvement in Vietnam ended after 10 years of fighting. The ceasefire agreement provided for the withdrawal of all U.S. troops and a promise from North Vietnam to release all prisoners of war within 60 days. At the same time, the Defense Department announced the end of the military draft. America now focused its high technology on the space race. The Skylab space station was launched into orbit, and 2 probes blasted off to take pictures of our solar system. Pioneer 11 flew by Jupiter and Saturn, while Mariner 10 traveled to Venus and Mercury. Back on Earth, Congress approved plans to build an oil pipeline across Alaska. Nearly 800 miles long, the pipeline would carry 2 million barrels of oil per day. And in California, the Miami Dolphins won Super Bowl VII, completing the NFL's only perfect season. This was America in 1973.
In 1981, 52 Americans held hostage for 444 days in Iran were released minutes after President Ronald Reagan was sworn into office. They returned to the U.S. on an Air Force plane dubbed Freedom, to be greeted by a crowd of 200,000 cheering Americans. 2 months later, President Reagan and 3 others were shot as they left a Washington hotel, All 4 survived the assassination attempt. In November, Columbia became the first space shuttle launched into orbit and later became the first spacecraft to be reused. Elsewhere on the technology frontier, doctors announced the birth of America's first test tube baby. And an affordable version of the personal computer was introduced by IBM, signaling the start of the desktop computer era. In another breakthrough, Sandra Day O'Connor became the first woman justice on the U.S. Supreme Court. This was America in 1981.
In 1992, the American military offered care and relief at home and abroad. When Hurricane Andrew devastated South Florida with 165-mile-an-hour winds, U.S. military personnel rushed in to help more than 250,000 people left homeless by the storm. In Somalia, U.S. Marines and Navy SEALs landed during the first phase of Operation Restore Hope. Their mission was to reestablish order among squabbling warlords so that relief workers could feed thousands of starving Somalis. 1992 was also a year for farewells. After nearly a century of American military presence in the Philippines, the last U.S. forces departed Subic Bay Naval Base in November. And Johnny Carson retired from The Tonight Show after nearly 30 years as host. This was America in 1992.
Welcome back to the present. We hope you've enjoyed this edition of 50 Great Years in American History. Look for more history and geography titles in the Just the Facts Learning Series. And remember, learning can be fun.